Welcome to the MuseCast, where we squeeze every last drop of inspiration out of Sunday's sermon.
Hey everybody, Dan Kent here. Obviously, Shauna is on a much-deserved vacation, and so it's just me today. And I already miss her laugh. So, I thought, since she's gone, I thought, well, I should bring a guest in. And Greg's sermon this week is called Gehenna, and it's about hell. And so I thought, what better way to kind of talk about the afterlife than with somebody who has already passed? And it just so happens with the new Zoom update, you can send invites on Zoom to people, in your network, but also people who are no longer with us. And so I thought, today, maybe what I would do is I would send a Zoom invite out to Vincent Van Gogh, and just to kind of get his take on what the afterlife is like. And so I didn't know for sure if Vincent would respond, but here he is. So Vincent, welcome to the MuseCast. So first of all, let me just say, Vincent, that I am just a huge fan of your paintings, and I think your works are genius, and really bummed that you didn't get more attention while you were with us. But just so you know, you have such a huge fan base, and we all love your work. And thank you for being here with us. I would love it if you could just share your perspective on what the afterlife is like. We might be having technical difficulties. This is a new feature on Zoom, so maybe that might be it. Also, Vincent, I know you cut off your ear, so maybe you're not hearing me. So just nod if you can hear me. Yeah, I think it's technical difficulties. We might have to reschedule this one and just stick with me for today's episode. I wish Shauna was here. I think she would have thought that was funny. Anyway, so Greg did a sermon this week called Gehenna, and it's about hell. And basically, I guess I'll do the summary. Boy, it was a rich sermon. There's a lot there. But he started off by sharing an excerpt from Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon on hell called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," and what a horrifying sermon that was. And the imagery that Edwards uses is just, well, it's very vivid, but also vividly, I think, reflects a God who is not very Christ-like. I'll just say that. And then Greg shared about his own upbringing in Catholic kind of schooling, and how Catholicism has used this fear of hell as sort of a way to raise money and to literally put the fear of God in people. But it's not just Catholicism. The Reformed kind of Christianity had a very, this was even, I think, even darker, in that they had this idea of eternal conscious torment, and hell is just like Jonathan Edwards said, who himself was a Reformed thinker. But the added kind of feature to the Reformed view of hell is that if you end up in hell, it's because that's where you were destined to end up. It had nothing to do with you. And so there's this sense in which we all deserve that. And if the only way to get out of that is if you are one of the lucky people whom God chooses sort of arbitrarily to save from that. And so that's the view of hell from Edward's perspective. But so Greg says, okay, well, what do we make of hell? I mean, it can't be that. It can't be this eternal conscious torment that is infinite and perfectly wicked and perfectly full and rich with suffering. It's got to be, a loving God would not do that. So how do you make sense of this idea of hell? And so he shared kind of three sort of principles that we should all kind of think about as we're kind of wrestling through our own understanding of what the Bible teaches about hell and so forth. So The first one is that he notes that the language about hell in the scripture is largely metaphorical, and you have to be really careful how you interpret some of the language, because if you interpret it all literally, well, then it doesn't make sense. And the example that he uses is that some verses talk about hell being like a fire, some verses talk about hell being dark, and if there's fire, it can't be dark. And so that's sort of an indicator light that these texts should not be interpreted literally, but we should look beyond the literal images for the truth that Jesus is teaching there. The second principle is this idea that hell is not something that God does to us, but rather we kind of bring hell onto ourselves. Hell is sort of this organic consequence of living ungodly ways. Rejecting God, rebelling against God is going to have these natural consequences. And that is largely what hell must be. It must be the sort of extended consequences of our ungodly life. And he talked about C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, where Lewis kind of shares this vision of hell, where hell is this place where you just get smaller and smaller and smaller as you collapse into yourself. And it's this pattern of self-centeredness that just kind of builds this momentum until you just kind of collapse into almost nothingness. And but the point to all of that is that there is this sense in which it is self-chosen. There, God has this open door. He's standing there with open arms, and he's hoping that we will turn from this kind of self-centeredness. The third principle is that hell, however you decide hell must be like X, Y, or Z, it has to reflect the reality that God is love. And so our vision of hell has to also kind of make sense with this idea that God is just like Jesus. In particular, Jesus' self-sacrificial love on the cross. And so how do you understand hell while also embracing this loving God? And, I agree with Greg that he mentioned in the sermon, Jonathan Edwards' view of hell does not really reconcile well with this idea of a loving God. And so I agree with Greg that it should be rejected. So what are the potential kind of ways that we could understand hell? Greg offers us three. The first one is sort of the C.S. Lewis kind of understanding of eternal conscious suffering, where except this kind of self-imposed sort of thing that we bring onto ourselves. And now, if that is ultimately eternal, the downside to that is that love in the end does not win. And that seems peculiar given the grandiose glory of our God and the perfection of our God and the overwhelming power of God's love. This idea that love would not ultimately win is it's sort of a mark against this view, because it seems peculiar that love would not win. The second perspective has been known as annihilationism, and that is just this idea that if we continue down this road where we just refuse to embrace God, we refuse to look outwards, we refuse to give up our self-centeredness, eventually God just gives us over to what we want. Eventually God says, if that's the way you want to be, I have to let you go. And since God is the one who sustains everything, including us, when God lets us go, then our existence is let go as well. And that is called annihilationism. The third perspective is often called universalism. And this is just this idea that love does win in the end. This intuition that God's love, the greatness of God's love, the idea that would not win people over is so kind of almost absurd. And so this idea of universalism says that eventually all people will give in to the hot glory of God's love. And that's sort of universalism. Now, the risk there is that we can easily kind of use that idea that, well, eventually it'll all work out, and it can kind of cheapen our resolve toward becoming more Christ-like now. We can go on living how we want to live because, in the end it'll work out. Jesus says that that's not the case, and you have to be really careful about that, because it's kind of the way I was talking with Greg on Saturday night, is that it makes me think of like learning languages. It's fascinating to watch kids like 4, 5, 6 years old learning new languages. They pick up new languages so quick. Me, if I were to try to learn a new language, my brain is so entrenched in itself that it's really hard to learn those new. It's not as malleable as a 5-year-old's brain is, and I think that you can apply that spiritually also, where you look at like, learning how to love others, learning how to build one another up, fighting against our impulse to judge, learning tactics to resolve conflict in peaceful ways. The earlier we can learn those things, the easier it is. As we develop these entrenched characters, these entrenched personalities, change becomes harder and harder and harder, and it hurts more and more and more. And so, I think what Greg is saying, and I think what Jesus is saying, is that, God's love might win in the end, but that's no excuse to put off growing in Christ-likeness, because now is the time. Now is the easiest time that you have before you to learn some of these things. And then Greg just finishes with this note that God is constantly in this everlasting sort of way pursuing us and drawing us always to himself. And the fact is that the more you resist God's draw, the more you resist this sense of this loving God, the more you resist that, the better you get at resisting it. And likewise, the more you seek that God, the more you seek out that God and pursue that God, the better you get at pursuing that God and seeking that God out. And so Greg just leaves us with this challenge that today is the day to get good at the right things, to start pursuing God in the way that God calls us to. And if there are things that you haven't let go of, if there are things that you continue to cling to that are self-centered, today is the day to start to release those things and get better at living without those crutches, those whatever sins those might be. So that's my summary. Normally, I pass this over to Shauna to get her feedback on the sermon. My guest, unfortunately, Vincent, is your audio working yet? Yeah, it doesn't look like it's working. So we'll just go on to my notes here. We did have a question a couple weeks ago where we asked the congregation, like, when you think of hell, what are the 2 words that come to mind? And we had a lot of really great responses. But the primary word, the number 1 word, was fire. That's the first one that came up. But then you had some other interesting ones: suffering, eternal. And then it starts to get more interesting. People talk about pain, separation, being alone, torture. That's you don't want that. But then there's words like emptiness, unfulfilled, doomed, things like that. It's interesting when you think of all the words that you could use. Like, where do those words come from? Well, they come from these kind of images that have been used, and these metaphors that have been used. And when you look at how hell has been used in the church historically, unfortunately, it's been used in a very manipulative way. And so there's been sort of a melodrama with it, where you get words like fire, like this constant burning, this suffering and torture and stuff like that. And so it's interesting to think about what words come to mind, because that reflects the narratives about hell which you have embraced. And behind those narratives is a picture of God. And so often we go through life with this picture of God and these narratives about these other parts of our theology, and we never ask, well, hey, does this narrative is this narrative, is this consistent with my picture of God? And what I would argue is that as we think about hell in particular, a lot of times I have found that the picture of hell that people carry a lot of times is not consistent with the picture of God that they carry. And so I think it's a really good practice, to just think about, like, what do I think about the afterlife and hell, and how does that cohere with my picture of God? I remember in seminary, I had this class, and we talked about hell. And I just, for some reason, I keep coming back to this doodle that I made, and I'll share it here. And that's, talk about, my, what would you call it, presuppositions about hell coming out in my notes. That's exactly what I doodled as we were talking about hell. And so that revealed that, obviously my presuppositions about hell was that there was fire, that there was suffering, that there was this anguish, and it came out in my doodles. With that, unfortunately, without Shauna, there's not as much give and take. So I'm going to just go to a closing nugget, and it's not as much fun to do the nugget dance by yourself either. Although I am a big Billy Idol fan, and I did like the song "Dancing with Myself." I don't think he was thinking of the nugget time dance. I think he was thinking of a different kind of dancing. But let me just close with this nugget. And it really goes back to Greg's point. I just love the way he said that, is that God is drawing us in at all times. God is constantly, perpetually pursuing you and me and his bride. And you think of the shepherd and the one lost sheep. And like a week and a half ago, I was thinking about the Sistine Chapel. And I just love that image where you have Adam reclining, and he's just this lazy kind of guy. And that's part why I like this painting so much. And he's reaching up his finger to God. In other words, he's like seeking God, but sort of like this lazy sort of way where he's just kind of reaching up. He's not really putting much effort into it. But it's so fascinating because God still reaches down his own finger and extends that infinite gap between God and us to meet us where we're at. And he honors any effort that we give, even if it's this lazy effort that we see in Adam in the painting. And another example is 1 Peter 3 is sort of a famous passage where we're told that during Jesus's death, during those 3 days, we're told that he descended into Hades. He preached the gospel to those from the times of Noah who had not heard. And there's this. It's a very weird passage, and you have to be really careful not to build a whole theology on it. But at the very least, it is an indicator. It shows us this glimpse of God's heart, that God will pursue and pursue and pursue. And if we do end up outside of relationship with God, it's not going to be because God has rejected us. It's going to be something in us where we have not opened ourselves up to God. And so my nugget then would be, continue to seek that loving God who does not want anyone to perish, including you and including me. And number 2, now is the time, like Greg said, to get good at seeking God, get good at opening our hearts to what God might be trying to do for us and what God might be trying to draw us into. Well, with that, thanks for joining me on this solo tour. I'm sorry we had technical difficulties with Mr. Van Gogh, but maybe we can reschedule that sometime. And thanks, everybody. And I look forward to chatting with you on YouTube. And you can send your questions and comments here. And maybe it's over here. I always get it confused which side it's on. Maybe it's in the middle. I don't know. But anyway, the point is, I have no point. I'll see you guys next week.